The cruelest thing you can do to a person is not to strike them. It is to decide they are worth nothing, and then to hand them the proof of it in writing. When the Duke of Thornmere put his young wife out of his house with a single trunk and not one coin to her name, he believed he was closing a door that would never open again. He sent her to the coldest corner of his lands, to a ruined farmstead the country folk called Larkhollow, and he trusted the winter to finish what his contempt had begun. He expected her to beg. He expected her to break. Instead, when the harvest came and his stewards rode out across the moor to gather what the land owed him, they found that not a single tenant would answer to any name but hers. The road north from Thornmere Court was not truly a road at all. It was a wound cut into the moor, and the cart that carried Linnet along it had been chosen, she was certain, for its cruelty rather than its comfort. It was a common farm cart. The seat was a bare plank laid across the rails. The wheels found every stone between the great house and the wild edge of the estate, and each one travelled up her spine like a small, deliberate accusation. She was 21 years old. 3 days passed. She had been the Duchess of Thornmere, mistress of a house with 40 chimneys and a table that could seat 60. Now she was a woman in a plain grey travelling dress with one trunk at her feet and 4 shillings sewn into the hem of her cloak. The shillings were her own. She had saved them in the years before her marriage, hidden them against exactly this kind of mourning, because some hard instinct in her had always known that a woman with nothing of her own is a woman who lives at the mercy of other people's moods. Her husband had not given her so much as a farthing when he cast her out. He had not looked at her at all. The wind came off the high ground with the smell of peat and cold rain. Linnet pulled her cloak tighter and kept her eyes forward and her back straight, because the coachman was watching her in the small, cracked mirror above the horse, waiting, she thought, for her to weep. She would not give him the satisfaction. She had learned long ago that tears were a kind of coin, and that once you spent them in front of the wrong person, they only made you poorer. She had not always been poor. That was the strange, aching center of the thing. She had been born to a gentleman, Mr. Josiah Merrow, who held a modest manor and 100 acres of good bottomland in the south of the county, and who had loved 2 things in this world beyond measure, his daughter and his soil. He had taught Linnet to read afield the way other fathers taught their sons to read Latin. He had walked her along the furrows when she was small enough to ride on his shoulders and shown her how to tell good drainage from bad, how to know by the colour of a stalk whether the wheat had rust in it, how to read a steward's account book and catch the places where the numbers had been made to lie. When the fever took him in her 19th year, it took the manor too, for it turned out that Josiah Merrow had loved his land more wisely than he had managed his debts, and the creditors came for everything. Linnet buried her father in the churchyard he had chosen and walked away from the only home she had ever known with a box of books and a heart like a stone. She had gone to Thornmere as a poor relation of a poor relation, a distant cousin taken in on sufferance to keep the account books of the Dowager's charities. She had expected to grow old there, useful and invisible. She had not expected the Duke. Corwin Vale, the 4th Duke of Thornmere, had married her 2 years ago. And even now Linnet could not have told you with certainty why. He was a proud man, hard along the jaw and harder behind the eyes, a man who ran his vast estate like a fortress under siege and trusted almost no one who carried his name. There were whispers about why. It was said that his mother had run away with a music master when Corwin was a boy, that she had emptied the family strongboxes on her way out the door and left the old Duke to die of the shame of it. It was said that Corwin had learned before he was 12 years old that the people closest to you are precisely the ones with the sharpest knives. Whatever the truth of it, he had grown into a man who watched for betrayal the way a farmer watches the sky for hail, always, and with a kind of grim certainty that it was coming. And yet, he had married her. There had been something between them at the start, something Linnet had been foolish enough to let herself believe in. He had come upon her once in the estate office, correcting an error in the timber accounts that his own steward had missed, and he had stood in the doorway and watched her work with an expression she had never seen on him before, as though she were a language he had given up on ever learning and had suddenly begun to understand. He had begun to seek her out. He had begun to bring her the difficult accounts himself, and to listen when she spoke, and once, on a bright cold afternoon in the orchard, he had told her that she was the only person at Thornmere who had never once tried to flatter him, and that he found it restful beyond words. They were married before the following spring. For a while, Linnet had thought herself the luckiest woman in the county. She had been wrong, and the reason for her wrongness had a name, and the name was Ambrose Vale. Ambrose was the Duke's cousin, a smooth, pleasant, perpetually smiling man who stood next in line to the dukedom so long as Corwin produced no son. He had a way of appearing wherever the Duke's attention landed, of being helpful in small, oily ways, of speaking well of everyone to their faces. Linnet had disliked him from the first, and she had made the great mistake of letting it show, because she had never learned to smile at a man she did not trust. Ambrose had not forgotten it. Ambrose forgot nothing. The trap had closed on a Tuesday. A letter had appeared, folded and sealed, addressed in a hand very like Linnet's own, arranging a meeting at the boundary wall with a man named Captain Reeve, an old acquaintance from her father's country, whom she had not seen in 5 years. A groom had come forward, weeping with well-rehearsed reluctance, to swear he had carried such letters before, and Corwin, who had spent his whole life waiting for the knife, had felt it go in exactly where he had always known it would, and had not paused for even one breath to wonder whether the hand that held it might be lying. He had summoned her to his study. He had laid the letter on the desk between them like a dead thing. And when she had told him plainly and without a single tear that she had never written it, that she had not seen Captain Reeve since she was a girl, that this was the work of a man who wanted her gone, Corwin had looked at her with a coldness that had frightened her more than any rage, and he had said only that he had heard a liar defend herself before, from his own mother's mouth, and that he would not be made a fool of twice. He gave her until morning to leave his house. He settled nothing upon her. He sent her, with a precision that Linnet understood only later, not to some distant city where she might vanish and be forgotten, but to Lark Hollow, the poorest and most broken holding on all his lands, a place a hard day's journey from the great house across open moor, where the last tenant had died owing 2 years of rent and where the roof, by every account, had fallen in. He meant for her to understand exactly how far she had fallen. He meant the moor and the winter to do quietly what a gentleman could not do with his own hands. What neither Corwin nor his smiling cousin had troubled to remember, because neither had ever once thought to ask, was that the woman they were sending to die on a ruined farm was the only person on the whole estate who actually knew how to make a ruined farm live. The cart crested the last rise as the light was failing. Below, in a fold of the darkening hills, Linnet saw the place that was meant to be her grave, and she leaned forward on the hard plank seat, and for the first time in 3 days, something in her went very still and very sharp, and very much awake. Lark Hollow sat in the bottom of the valley like a thing that had been dropped and left where it fell. There was a low stone farmhouse with a sagging roof and one shuttered window hanging by a single hinge. There was a barn, with its great doors gaping. There were outbuildings sunk to their knees in nettles, a byre, a pig cote, a dovecote with no doves, and beyond them a spread of fields gone grey and wild, the hedges broken, the gates down, the good dark earth choked under a winter's worth of dead thistle. To a fine lady from a fine house, it would have looked like the end of the world. Linnet did not look at it like a fine lady. She looked at it the way her father had taught her, and what she saw beneath the ruin made her breath catch. She saw that the walls of the farmhouse were sound stone and only wanted a roof. She saw that the fields, for all their neglect, lay well to the south and drained toward the beck, which meant the water would run off them and not sit and rot the roots. She saw the dark, greasy richness of the soil where the cartwheel had cut it open, the kind of soil men in the south would have wept to own. She saw a farm that no one had loved for a long time, and she knew with the sudden certainty of a woman recognizing her own face in a glass that she could love it. The cart lurched to a stop in the yard. The coachman did not climb down to help her. He jerked his head at the trunk, waited just long enough for her to drag it off the boards herself, and then turned the horse and rattled away up the track without a word, taking the last thin thread that tied her to the great house with him. Lynette stood alone in the freezing yard with her trunk at her feet and the dark coming down, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly the space of 10 breaths. Then she picked the weight up and set it aside, because self-pity was a field that grew nothing, and she had work to do before the light was gone. She had taken 3 steps toward the farmhouse when a voice came out of the barn. "Whatever you're here to steal, there's naught left. Others got here before you." An old man came out of the shadow of the gaping doors. He was built like a fence post that had weathered 40 winters, all knuckle and sinew, with a face burned brown and creased deep, and a pair of pale, suspicious eyes that took her in from her mud-hemmed cloak to her town boots, and plainly found her wanting. He carried a billhook loosely in one hand, not raised, but not put away either. A lifetime of hard use had left him stooped, but he set himself between her and the house as squarely as a much younger man. "I am not here to steal anything," Lynette said. "My name is Lynette. I have been sent to live here." The old man laughed, a short, dry sound like a spade going into gravel. "Sent to live here? By who?" "By the Duke of Thornmere." "The Duke." He looked her over again, slower this time, and something moved behind the pale eyes that she could not read. "The Duke doesn't send fine women to Lark Hollow. The Duke sends nobody here. That's the whole of what Lark Hollow is good for, being where nobody's sent." He spat into the nettles. "You'd best get back on whatever brought you. Whatever brought me is halfway up the track by now, and did not wait to be thanked." Lynette did not step back. She had faced down creditors and disdainful housekeepers and a duke with ice in his voice, and she had learned that a person who retreats from a suspicious man only teaches him he was right to be suspicious. "You have not told me your name." "Didn't mean to." But after a moment, grudgingly, as though the words cost him a coin each, "Amos Fenn. I mind this place, or what's left of it. Have done since old Barrow died and the rest of them cleared off." "Then you are exactly the man I need." Lynette stepped past him, not toward the house but toward the barn, and put her hand on the frame of the ruined doors, feeling the wood. Amos followed her, plainly thrown that his warning had not sent her running. She looked up at the dark loft, at the pale streaks against the far wall where the last light came through the broken roof. "You have a leak on the north pitch, over the old hay. That is why it rotted. It was not damp rising, it was rain coming down. If it had been damp rising, the rot would start at the floor, and it does not. It starts at the beam." She turned and looked at him. How many of the field gates are past mending, and how many only want a new hinge and a strong arm? The billhook drifted down until its point rested in the dirt. Amos Fenn stared at her the way a man stares at a dog that has suddenly spoken to him in the king's English. "Most want a hinge," he said slowly. 3 are past it. "Good. Hinges are cheap, and I can forge a passable one myself if there is an anvil left standing in that smithy, and I saw as I came in that there is. The 3 that are past it we will rob for timber to mend the barn doors, because a farm with a barn keeps its seed dry, and a farm that keeps its seed dry does not starve." Lynette drew her cloak around her and looked out across the darkening fields, and her voice, when it came again, had lost its town softness and found something older and harder underneath. "I did not come here to die quietly, Mr. Fenn, whatever the man who sent me may have intended. I came here because it is the one thing in this world that is now mine to work, and I mean to work it. You may help me, or you may sit in that barn and watch me do it alone, but I would very much rather you helped." For a long moment the old man said nothing. The wind moved through the broken hedges. Somewhere down the valley a curlew called, that long falling cry that sounds like grief. Then Amos Fenn did a thing he had not done in front of another living soul in 3 years. He laughed, a real laugh this time, and shook his grizzled head, and stood the billhook against the barn wall. "There's a fire wants lighting in that kitchen," he said, "before the pair of us freeze to death arguing in a farmyard. Mind the third step of the threshold. It's rotten through. He started toward the house, then stopped, and looked back at her with the pale eyes narrowed, though the suspicion in them had changed into something more like wonder. You talk like Barrow used to, like the land's a person you're on speaking terms with. He shook his head again. The Duke sent you here to be rid of you. You know that, girl. I know it, Lynette said. Then you should know one more thing. Amos lowered his voice, though there was no one for miles to hear. You're not the first thing he's tried to be rid of out this way, and the man who does his ridding for him rode through here not a fortnight past, asking after a farm nobody's supposed to care about, asking real particular. He held her eyes. A smiling gentleman. Called himself Vale. The cold that went through Lynette then had nothing to do with the wind. The first week at Lark Hollow was a war fought against cold and rot and the failing daylight, and Lynette won it the only way such wars are ever won, which is one small skirmish at a time. She and Amos got the great kitchen hearth drawing again by the second morning, and once there was fire, there was heat, and once there was heat, the house stopped feeling like a tomb and began very slowly to feel like a place where a person might live. She swept out 3 years of drifted leaves and dead starlings. She found the well sound and the water sweet. She mended the hanging shutter with her own hands, and if the hinge she forged in the cold little smithy was a clumsy thing, it held, and holding was all she asked of it. Amos watched her work with the wary fascination of a man who has been told all his life that fine ladies are made of glass and is discovering, against his every expectation, that this one was made of something a good deal harder to break. But Lark Hollow did not sit alone on the moor. It was the head of a cluster of small holdings scattered along the beck, 7 families in all, and tenants of the Duke who had been forgotten as thoroughly as the ruined farm at their centre. Lynette had seen their thin chimney smoke on her second day, and known she would have to face them, and known too, from the set of things, that they would not be glad to see her. To a tenant, a new face from the great house meant one thing only. It meant a hand held out for rent, and nothing given back. The reckoning came on the 5th night, and it came in the shape of a boy. He was perhaps 9 years old, barefoot despite the frost, and he hammered on the Lark Hollow door near midnight with the desperate strength of a child who has run a long way in the dark. Amos got to him first. The boy's name was Watt, and his words fell over one another. His father's cow was down and could not calve, had been laboring since dusk, and the beast was failing, and his mother had sent him running because old Fen at the Hollow was said to know beasts, and if the cow died there would be nothing at all, to carry the family through to spring. I know beasts a little, Amos said grimly, reaching for his coat. Not enough for a bad calving. That wants a surgeon's hand, and we've none. You have mine, said Lynette, and she was already pulling on her cloak. The 2 men, old and young, both turned and stared at her. It is no place for a lady, Amos began. I have turned more calves than you have years, Mr. Fen, and I did it with these 2 hands. She took the lantern from the hook by the door. Which way, Watt? Run ahead and tell your mother help is coming. The holding was half a mile down the beck, a low turf-roofed cottage with a byre built against its flank, and the byre, when Lynette ducked into it, was a scene from the last day of the world. A young man knelt in the straw, with his sleeves shoved back and his arms wet to the elbow, and his face grey with exhaustion and terror. His wife stood pressed against the wall with a fist to her mouth. And on the ground between them lay the cow, a red and white beast with her sides heaving and her great eye rolling white, too spent even to bellow, failing by inches with the calf stuck fast inside her. The young husband looked up at the fine woman in the doorway, and his face twisted, because he knew who she must be, and he had no time and no patience left for gentry come to gawp at his ruin. There's naught here for you, he said hoarsely. Go back to the hall. And then a second voice came from the shadow at the byre's far end, low and hard as a stone wall. Let her look, Tom. Let the Duke's woman look at what the Duke's neglect has brought a good family to. Let her carry the sight of it back to her feather bed. The speaker came forward into the lantern light. She was a woman past 60, tall and gaunt and straight, with a face like a cliff and eyes that had plainly wept all the tears they meant to weep a long lifetime ago and would spend no more on anyone. This, Lynette would learn, was Keziah Marsh, who had buried a husband and 2 grown sons on this moor, and who spoke for the 7 families as a general speaks for an army, and whose contempt for everyone whose hands were soft was the settled contempt of 40 hard years. Every soul in that byre feared her tongue. She looked at Lynette the way one looks at a stain. Lynette did not answer the contempt. She had no time for it, and neither did the cow. She set the lantern on a beam, unclasped her cloak and dropped it, and then, before a single person in that byre understood what she meant to do, she pushed up the sleeves of her one good gown, knelt down in the soiled straw, and laid her hand flat against the straining flank of the laboring beast. How long has she been fast? Her voice had gone flat and quick and certain. The young husband gaped. Since dusk. It will not come. It is turned wrong. I have tried. I cannot. It is turned wrong because it is coming backward and one hind leg is folded under. I can feel it. She was already at work, her arm sliding in past the wrist, her eyes fixed on nothing, her whole self poured down into her hands the way her father had taught her in a byre very like this one, years and years ago. I need lard or butter, whatever fat you have, and I need it now. I need a length of clean cord. And I need every one of you to stop weeping and start doing, because this cow is not dead yet, and I do not intend to let her die. Nobody moved for the space of a breath. Then Keziah Marsh, of all people, barked, "You heard her!" And the byre came alive. What followed took the better part of an hour, and it was brutal, slippery, exhausting work, and there was one long moment in the middle of it when even Lynette believed she had lost them both. But she found the folded leg and she worked it straight, and she looped the cord and timed her pulling to the cow's own failing efforts, and at last, in a rush that knocked her back onto her heels, the calf came, wet and dark and horribly still, not breathing. Lynette did not stop to grieve it. She cleared its mouth with 2 fingers, seized a wisp of straw, and tickled the calf's nostril sharply with it, and the sudden tickle made the small creature cough and shudder and drag in its first ragged breath of the cold world. A heifer calf, a living heifer calf, which in 3 years would be a milking cow, which was the difference between this family surviving and this family scattering to the workhouse. The young wife burst into tears. The young husband made a sound that was not quite a word. And Lynette Vale, born a gentleman's daughter, wed to a duke, cast out without a penny, knelt in the muck of a tenant's byre with her one good gown ruined and soiled to the shoulder, and her hair fallen loose about her face, and felt more like herself than she had felt in 2 long years inside a palace. Keziah Marsh looked down at her without speaking. Something in the old stone face had cracked, and behind the crack was something that looked almost like fear, as though a fixed rule of her whole existence had just been broken in front of her. "You're no lady," Keziah said slowly. Lynette pushed the wet hair out of her eyes with the back of a filthy wrist, and for the first time since the road she smiled. "No," she agreed. "I am a farmer's daughter, and I think, Mrs. Marsh, that you and I have a very great deal to talk about." They talked at Keziah Marsh's own table 3 nights later, and it was the whole 7 families crowded into the one cottage that would hold them, and it was the beginning of everything. Lynette had not asked for the gathering. Keziah had summoned it, in the way that Keziah summoned things, which was to say a word to one woman at the well and let it travel, and by the appointed evening they had all come, wary and silent, to see the Duke's cast-off wife who turned calves with her own hands. They sat along the walls and stood in the doorway, the Collies and the Fanshaws and old Ned Pruey and the rest, and they watched Lynette the way you watch a fire you are not yet sure is friendly. She did not flatter them. She had learned that much from her own husband, in the days when he had loved her for it. She told them the plain truth instead. "You know what I am," she said. "You know the Duke sent me here to be rid of me, and you know he chose Lark Hollow because he believed no one could live on it. He was wrong about that. But he was not wrong to think that a farm no one can make pay is a farm easily got rid of, and I think, if you will hear me out, that getting rid of Lark Hollow is only the smallest part of what is coming for all of you." That got their attention, Keziah at the table's head went very still. "There is a man," Lynette went on, "who calls himself the Duke's cousin and the Duke's friend, and who is in truth neither. His name is Ambrose Vale. He stands to inherit everything the Duke owns so long as the Duke dies without a son, and he has spent years making certain the Duke never has one." She let that sit a moment. "He is the man who forged the letter that saw me put out of the great house, and he is, I am now nearly certain, the man behind the surveyor who has been seen walking your fields with a chain and a notebook." Ned Preo made a low sound. The old people knew what a man with a chain meant. It meant measuring, and measuring meant clearing. "Sheep," said Keziah, and the word fell into the room like a coffin lid. "He means to put us off and run the whole North Moor as one great sheep walk. No tenants, no rents to collect and no repairs to make. Just wool, and one shepherd where there were 7 families." Her hard eyes fixed on Lynette. "We have smelled it coming for a 12-month, and you are telling us the man who wants us gone is the same man who wanted you gone." "I am telling you exactly that." Lynette set her hands flat on the table. "Which means, Mrs. Marsh, that his enemy is your friend and you are looking at her." There was a long silence. Then Tom Colley, the young husband whose cow she had saved, spoke up from the wall, and his voice was rough. "And what does the Duke's friend say to that? To his cousin clearing us off?" It was the hardest question, and Lynette answered it honestly, because a lie told to these people now would poison everything that came after. "I do not know what the Duke would say, because the Duke has been made deaf and blind by a man he trusts and by his own old wounds, and he will hear nothing from me, so I do not intend to win this by appealing to him." She looked around the crowded room, at the thin faces and the work-ruined hands and the frightened children, and something rose up in her that was not quite anger and not quite hope, but was made of both. "I intend to win it by making Lark Hollow and these 7 farms the most productive land on the whole estate. A cleared farm is a failed farm, a farm no one wants. But a farm that pays, a farm that sends good corn and fat beasts and honest rent up to the great house year on year, that farm cannot be cleared without every neighbor for 20 miles asking why a duke would tear down the one part of his lands that flourishes. Ambrose Vale's whole scheme rests on us being poor and useless, so we are going to stop being poor and useless, together." "Fine words," said Keziah. "From a woman with no money, no standing, and no name left worth the having." "I have no money," Lynette agreed. "But I know how to read a field and how to keep an account book that cannot be cheated, and I know the drainage and the rotation and the price of grain in 3 counties, and I know that this soil is better than anything the men who neglected it ever deserved. You have the hands and the knowledge of this particular ground that I lack. Give me your trust and your labor, and I will give you every hour of my life and every scrap of what I know, and I will not take a shilling more than my share of what we make, not as your lady." She said it slowly and clearly, so that not one of them could mistake her. "As your manager, as one of you." It was the reframing that undid them, though not one of them could have named it so. They had braced themselves for a lady who would command them and take from them. What sat at Keziah Marsh's table offering to bleed alongside them was something none of them had ever once been offered in all their lives, which was a partner who held the power and meant to share it. Old Ned Preo was the first to put his cracked hand on the table, palm down, an old country sign of a bargain struck. "My grandfather broke this ground," he said. "I'd sooner die working it than live watching sheep eat it. I'm with the lass." One by one, around the room, the rough hands came down on wood. Keziah Marsh was the last. She looked at Lynette for a long, long moment, and whatever she saw there seemed at last to satisfy some question she had been asking the gentry her whole bitter life and never once had answered to her liking. She laid her hand flat on the table beside the others. "God help us all," said Keziah. "We're going to fight a duke." "No," Lynette said quietly. "We are going to make him rich, whether he likes it or not. It is a far crueler thing to do to a proud man, and it will save us all. Now, who among you can tell me which of these fields has not been marled in living memory, because I think I know where our first 100 bushels are hiding?" Winter broke slowly over the North Moor that year, grudging as an old debt, but it broke, and as it did, the thing they had promised one another at Keziah's table began, impossibly, to come true. They worked. God, how they worked. Lynette was up before the light every morning of those weeks, and the shape of her days would have been unrecognizable to the pale duchess who had drifted through the great house counting other people's charities. She learned every field of the 7 holdings by its own name and its own temper. She and Amos and the collie boys dug out a beck ditch that had been choked since before Watt was born, and watched a whole sour half-acre begin to sweeten as the standing water drained away. She organized the marling of the tired fields, teaching them to dig the pale lime-rich clay from the pit at the top, holding and spread it thin across the acid ground, an old trick her father had sworn by, the kind of slow, patient improvement that costs nothing but labor and pays for a generation. She got the smithy roaring and mended over those weeks, near 40 gates and hinges and harrow teeth, and if her forge work never grew elegant, it grew strong. And a strange thing began to happen to Lynette Vale in the middle of all this labor, a thing she noticed one grey morning and could not at first put a name to. She was not afraid. She woke in the little farmhouse to the sound of Amos splitting kindling in the yard and the smell of the porridge Nell Colley had taught her to make, and she lay for a moment under the heaped blankets and understood that no bell would ring to summon her, that no cold voice would find fault with her at the breakfast table, that no smiling cousin would be watching her over the rim of a cup for the smallest slip. There was only the work and the good tired ache of her own body, and 7 families who were glad this morning that she was alive. She had been mistress of 40 chimneys and had never once felt safe beneath a single one of them. She had been cast out to a ruin on a bare moor, and here, of all the unlikely places in the world, some knot in her chest that had been pulled tight since her father's death had quietly, without her permission, begun to loosen. Safety, it turned out, had never been a thing you could be given along with a title. It was a thing you built with your own hands and defended and shared. But the labor alone would not have won her the North Moor. What won it, finally, was the ledger. The 7 families sold their surplus grain, such as it was, through the estate mill down at Cross Ford, and the miller there was a heavy, sweating man named Rourke, who held the Duke's warrant to grind the northern corn and collect the northern dues. Lynette had heard the tenants grumble about Rourke from her first week, and had thought it only the eternal grumbling of farmers against millers, until the morning old Ned Prue brought her his tally sticks and his memory and asked her shyly whether the numbers were right because he had never had his letters and could not check them, and something had felt wrong to him for years. Lynette checked them. She sat up 2 nights with a stub of candle and the tally sticks and every scrap of account she could gather from all 7 families, and what she found made her go cold, and then slowly made her furious. Rourke was robbing them. He had been robbing them for years, in 100 small ways too small for any one unlettered farmer to prove. He short-weighted their grain when they brought it in and paid them for less than they delivered. He charged them a grinding toll a full third above the rate the Duke's own warrant allowed, and pocketed the difference. And worst of all, he had for 6 years been reporting the northern farms to the great house as barely paying their way, entering their dues short in his books and skimming the rest, which meant that the very poverty Ambrose Vale now pointed to as his reason for clearing the land was a poverty that Rourke had manufactured, and Ambrose, Lynette had no doubt at all, had arranged to have him manufacture. It was, she realized, staring at the guttering candle, the same trick that had been played on her. Make a thing look worthless, then destroy it, and call the destroying a mercy. She did not go to Rourke. She did not go to the Duke. She did what her father had taught her to do, which was to build a case so complete and so plain that a child could follow it, in a fair, clear hand, with every figure sourced and every theft named, 6 years of it, totaled at the bottom to the shilling. £240, near enough, stolen from the poorest families on the estate. She made 2 copies. One she sewed into the lining of her trunk. The other she carried, one bright cold morning at the very edge of spring, down to Cross Ford, and laid on the miller's own counter in front of him, and watched the blood drain out of his heavy face as she read the total aloud. She did not threaten him. She did not have to. She simply told him that from this day the 7 families would weigh their own grain in front of witnesses, that the toll would drop to its lawful rate that very hour, and that the copy of his 6 years of thieving now rested in a safe place to be sent to the magistrate at Kelby the instant any harm came to her, or to any tenant of the North Moor, or to a single sheaf of their corn. Then she wished him good morning and walked back up onto the moor with the whole valley opening out below her. And by the time she reached Lark Hollow, the news had run ahead of her the way news runs among people with nothing but each other, and Keziah Marsh was standing in the Lark Hollow yard. The old woman did not embrace her. That was not Keziah's way, and never would be. She simply held Lynette's eyes for a moment, and then she said the thing that Lynette would remember, years afterward, as the true beginning of the harvest to come. "There's not a soul on this moor," said Keziah Marsh, "who will answer to any name but yours now, not the Duke's, not his cousin's, yours. You'd best understand what you've made, girl, because there's no unmaking it." Lynette stood in the cold spring sunlight and understood it, and was not afraid. Far away, a proud man who had not slept well in a long time was about to hear a rumor out of the north that would not let him rest. A long day's journey to the south, in a study with 40 windows, the Duke of Thornmere sat with an untouched glass at his elbow and could not for the life of him say why he was not sleeping. The reports had come first as small things, easily dismissed. The North Moor was paying better this quarter. The Crossford Mill returns had risen sharply, and no one could quite explain it. There was talk in the market at Kelby of the Lark Hollow ground, of all the God-forgotten ground on the whole estate, come suddenly alive under a new hand. Corwin Vale had listened to these things with a face of stone, and had told himself they meant nothing, and had gone on not sleeping. It was Ambrose who kept the subject smoothly in motion, and it was Ambrose, watching his cousin over the rim of a wineglass, who first understood that the small things were becoming dangerous. "It is the woman, of course," Ambrose said one evening, with the light, easy contempt he had perfected over years. "One hears she plays at being a farmer now, grubbing in the dirt with the tenants. It would be pitiable if it were not so vulgar." He turned his glass in the firelight. "But it does raise a difficulty, cousin. You cannot in good conscience proceed with clearing the North Moor for the new sheep walk while the whole county is chattering about how the North Moor has never flourished so. It makes the improvement look like spite. It makes it look, forgive me, as though you are punishing the poor devils for her sake." He let the poison settle. "Far better to act now, before the harvest, before the chatter grows louder. Sign the notices. Let the leases end at Michaelmas. By spring it will all be sheep and silence, and no one will remember there was ever a fuss." And Corwin, who trusted this man because this man was blood, and because trusting had grown too tiring to keep resisting, took the papers Ambrose slid across the desk and signed them without reading past the first, and felt as he did it a cold small wrongness that he could not name and did not heed. The notices reached Lark Hollow 4 days later, carried by a sullen rider who would not dismount. Lynette read hers, standing in the farmyard with the spring wind snapping at the paper. It was plain enough. The leases of all 7 holdings of the North Moor were terminated as of the coming Michaelmas. The tenants were to quit their homes and their fields by that day. It was signed with the Duke's own name and sealed with the Duke's own seal, and it was, Lynette understood at once, Ambrose Vale's masterpiece, because it did not need to be a lie. He had simply arranged the facts until the truth itself became a weapon. The 7 families gathered in the Lark Hollow yard, and their faces were the faces of people who have been waiting all their lives for the blow they always knew would fall. Michaelmas was harvest time. He meant to turn them out with the corn still standing in the fields, so that they would lose even the crop they had broken their backs to raise. "So that's the end of it," said Tom Colley bitterly. "Fine words at Keziah's table, and it comes to this. A paper and a seal, and we're done." "It comes to nothing of the kind," said Lynette. They looked at her. She had folded the notice into a small, hard square, and her grey eyes had gone bright and cold in a way that even Keziah had learned to respect. "Hear me," she said. "A paper is only worth the fear it puts in you. That is the whole of its power, and it is the only power it has. This man believes we will read his seal and scatter like sheep before a dog, because that is what frightened people have always done for men like him, and he has never in his life met people who would not. She lifted her chin. I was handed a paper once. It said I was worthless. It was signed and sealed by the highest hand in this county, and I will tell you what I did with it. I built Lark Hollow with the ashes of it. A name and a seal decide nothing on their own. Corn in the barn decides things. Beasts fat in the byre decide things. 7 families standing shoulder to shoulder with a full harvest at their backs. That decides things. So we are not going to weep over Michaelmas. We are going to make this the greatest harvest the North Moor has seen in 100 years, and we are going to bring it in whole, and then let any man alive try to explain to the county why a duke tore down the one corner of his lands that fed him. There was a silence. Then old Ned Prue began, slowly, to smile. A full harvest, Keziah murmured, and something fierce and old woke in her cliff of a face. By Michaelmas, every field. Every field, said Linnet. And when they come to clear us, they will find not an empty moor, but a moor full of people and full of grain and full of witnesses. Let them come. I would very much like them to come. What she did not say, what she folded away small and hard inside herself along with the notice, was the thing she had seen when she broke the seal. She had kept her husband's accounts for 2 years. She knew his hand, as she knew her own. And the signature on the order to ruin 7 families had been made by a man whose pen had not paused, not once, not even at the word Michaelmas, which meant he had signed it without reading it, which meant that somewhere behind his cold and dreadful pride, Corwin Vale did not yet know what had been done in his name. It should not have mattered to her. She told herself it did not. But that night she lay awake a long time, and it was not the eviction that kept her from sleeping. The emissary came on a morning in late summer, when the corn stood tall across the reclaimed fields and had just begun to turn from green toward gold, and the whole moor smelled of ripening grain, and he came, as such men do, expecting no trouble at all. His name was Skell. He was a narrow, grey, incurious man, a land agent by trade, the sort who has learned to feel nothing much about the ruin he delivers because feeling would only slow the work. He rode up the Lark Hollow track with a bailiff and 4 hired men behind him and a leather case of papers across his saddle. And his instructions from Mr. Ambrose Vale were simple. He was to survey the 7 holdings for the coming enclosure, to mark the fields for the new walls, and to remind these people firmly of the Michaelmas date, so that there would be no unpleasant surprises when the day came and the shepherds arrived. A show of force, Ambrose had said, to settle their nerves. They will grumble. Peasants always grumble. But show them the men and the papers, and they will understand which way the wind blows. Skell rode into the Lark Hollow yard, and the wind, he discovered, was not blowing the way he had been told. They were waiting for him. Not scattered and fearful in their separate cottages, but gathered, all of them, the 7 families entire, near 40 souls from white-haired Ned Prue to the babe on Nell Colley's hip, standing together in a silent wall across the mouth of the yard. Amos Fenn stood at one end with a scythe he had spent the morning sharpening for reasons that had nothing to do with corn. Keziah Marsh stood at the center like the keel of a ship. And a little before them all stood a slight woman in a plain gown with ink on her fingers, and not one trace of fear in her face. Skell drew rein. His hired men shifted uneasily behind him. There is a thing that happens to hired men when the frightened crowd they were promised turns out to be a wall of people who have decided, all together, that they are done being afraid, and the thing that happens is that the hired men remember they are being paid by the day and not by the wound. I am here on the authority of the estate, Skell announced, to survey these lands ahead of the Michaelmas clearance. Stand aside and let my men pass. Nobody moved. I will speak to whoever holds charge of this place. Skell tried again, louder. Fetch me your bailiff. Fetch me the man who answers for the North Moor. And here it happened, the thing that would be told and retold in the alehouses of 3 counties before the year was out, the thing that gave the whole affair its name. Old Ned Prue, who had never in 70 years spoken up to a gentleman, folded his cracked hands over the head of his stick and said, mild as milk, "There's no man answers for the North Moor, sir." "Then who does?" Ned nodded slowly toward Linnet, and then, without a word spoken between them, without any signal given, every soul in that yard turned and looked at her too, 40 faces turning as one, and the meaning of it could not have been plainer if they had shouted it from the fells. Skell looked from the wall of turned faces to the slight ink-stained woman they had all turned toward, and he understood with the sinking certainty of a man who has badly misjudged his morning that whatever authority his papers claimed, it stopped dead at the edge of this yard, and that inside it there was one authority only, and it was hers. "Madam," he said, and his voice had changed. "I was not told." "No," Linnet agreed. "You were not. You were told these were broken people on worthless ground who would scatter when you frightened them. You were told a great many convenient things by a man named Ambrose Vale, and I imagine you are only now beginning to wonder how many of them were true." She walked toward him, unhurried, and she did not raise her voice because a woman with 40 people at her back has no need to raise her voice. "Here is a true thing, Mr. Skell, to carry home in place of your survey. Every acre you were sent to measure is under crop. That crop belongs, in law and in labor, to the families standing before you, and it will be harvested by them and no one else. If you set one chain across one furrow before Michaelmas, you will be trampling a standing crop, which is trespass and destruction both. And I have a clean account of 6 years of thieving from the Crossford Mill that shows exactly what kind of men run this scheme, and a magistrate at Kelby who will be very interested to read it." She stopped an arm's length from his horse. "So you may survey the public road, sir, for that is the only ground here that is not spoken for. Good day." Skell looked at her. He looked at the scythe in Amos Fenn's hands and the wall of silent faces and the babe on Nell Colley's hip. Then he wheeled his horse without another word, and his hired men were only too glad to follow, and the whole troop of them clattered back down the track a good deal faster than they had come up it. The tenants did not cheer. That was not their way. And besides, they all understood that nothing had been won, only postponed. But Kezia Marsh came to stand at Linnet's shoulder as the dust settled, and looked down the empty track, and spoke low. "He'll go straight to Vale with it, and Vale will not send an agent next time." Her hard eyes found Linnet's. "He'll come himself, or he'll bring the one man whose word can undo us all." She did not have to say the name. "You've backed a proud man into a corner, girl, in front of the whole county. A proud man in a corner is the most dangerous thing God ever made. What will you do when it's the Duke himself who rides up that track?" Linnet watched the last of the dust drift down toward Crossford, and for a long moment she did not answer, because the truth was that she did not know. She did not have long to wonder. He came within the fortnight. He came alone, which no one had expected, and that was the first thing that undid Linnet's careful defenses. Because a duke who means to crush you brings men, and a man who comes alone has come to see the truth with his own eyes. She was in the high field when the word ran up from the valley that a lone rider was on the track, a great dark horse, a gentleman, no colours, no servants. By the time she had walked down, he had already dismounted in the Lark Hollow yard, and he was standing very still in the middle of it, turning slowly, looking at the mended barn and the swept yard and the fat pig in the sound new coat and the green fields climbing away on every side, and Linnet stopped at the gate and looked at her husband for the first time in the better part of a year. Corwin Vale had not been sleeping. She could see it at once, in the hollows beneath his eyes, and the new grey at his temple, and the way his coat hung looser than it had. He looked like a man being eaten from the inside by something he could not name and could not stop, and when he turned and saw her, the look that crossed his face was so raw and so unguarded that she had to steady herself against the gatepost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The whole moor seemed to hold its breath. "You did this," he said at last. His voice was rough, disbelieving. He gestured at the living farm around him, at the ruin she had raised from the dead. They told me you played at farming. They told me it was vulgar. They did not tell me that you had taken the worst ground on my estate and made it the best. That is not playing." He looked at her, and his jaw worked. "Nothing about you was ever what they told me." "No," Lynette said quietly. "It was not. But you believed them anyway." The words were not cruel, and that was what made them terrible. She had not shouted them. She had simply set the truth down in front of him, plain, the way she set down a column of figures and let it be what it was. Corwin flinched as though she had struck him. And then, because he was a proud man and pride is the last thing to die, he tried once more to hold the old ground. There was a letter. There was a witness. A man does not. "There was a forgery," said Lynette, "and a servant paid to weep. You knew my hand, Corwin. You had 2 years of my hand in your account books, and you did not so much as hold that letter up beside a single page of it before you put me out of your house without a coin. You did not look. You did not want to look." Now, at last, something came into her voice. Not tears, she had promised herself long ago she would spend no more tears on this, but a low and steady fire. "Do you know why you did not look? Because a part of you had been waiting your whole life for the person nearest you to betray you, ever since your mother emptied the strong boxes and left your father to die of the shame. You have carried that wound like a lantern, held it up to every face that ever came close to you, and called the shadows it threw proof. Ambrose knew that about you. Ambrose has always known it. He did not have to make you believe I was false. He only had to remind you that you were afraid." Corwin Vale stood in the yard of the farm his wife had built out of nothing, and something broke in him, quietly and completely, the way a beam that has been rotting for years finally gives all at once. He put out a hand to the barn wall to steady himself, and he bowed his dark head, and for a long moment the Duke of Thornmere could not speak at all. And here was the moment that mattered, the hinge on which everything turned. Lynette had every right in the world to leave him standing there in his ruin. She had every right to pity him, which would have been its own kind of cruelty, or to savor it, which would have been another. She did neither. She walked across the yard, and she stood before her husband, and she did the one thing he could not have borne, and could not have expected, and had not been given by a single living soul since he was a boy. She spoke to him as an equal, without pity and without triumph, as one wounded person to another. "I am not going to comfort you," she said. "You do not need comforting. You need to see clearly, perhaps for the first time in your life, and clear sight is a cold thing, and I will not pretend otherwise. So look. Ambrose forged the letter that ruined me. Ambrose arranged the mill to rob these families for 6 years, so that he might call their poverty a reason to clear them. Ambrose put the Michaelmas notice under your pen and watched you sign it without reading, because he has spent his whole life counting on you not to look too closely at the things nearest your own hand. He wants you with no wife and no son and no heir but himself, and he is very close to having it. That is the truth, Corwin. I did not come back to your side to tell you. You came to mine." He raised his head and looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he made no attempt to hide it, which was perhaps the most changed thing about him. "How can you even stand to speak to me," he said hoarsely, "after what I did? Because you were once the only man alive who valued me for the one thing everyone else despised in me, which was that I would not flatter you. I have not started flattering you now." The ghost of something almost gentle crossed her face. "You loved me once for telling you the truth, Corwin. I am telling it to you still. What you do with it is no longer mine to decide." The Duke was silent for a while. When he spoke again, something in him had settled, and the pride was not gone from it. Pride like his does not vanish. But it had turned, at last, to face in a new direction. "Michaelmas is 3 weeks away," Corwin said slowly. "And my cousin believes I am still his creature." He straightened, and something of the formidable man he might have been, absent the wound, came into his bearing. "Then let us none of us disturb that belief. Not for 3 weeks. Let him come to his harvest, Lynette. Let him come to it certain of everything." A hard light was kindling in his eyes now, the light of a proud man who has finally chosen the right thing to be proud of. And let us be waiting. Lynette looked at her husband, at this ruined, wakened, dangerous man standing in the yard of everything she had built without him, and she understood that the charade the smiling cousin had built was about to be turned inside out, and that this time she would not be standing in it alone. "There is a great deal to do," she said, "before the corn comes in." "Then teach me," said the Duke of Thornmere. "I find I have a great deal to learn." Michaelmas came in gold. The corn of the North Moor stood ripe and heavy across every reclaimed field, the finest crop the oldest soul in the 7 families could remember, and on the morning of the clearing, the whole moor was out among it with the sun barely up, for they had agreed to begin the harvest that very day, all 7 farms together, field by field, so that when Ambrose Vale arrived to turn them off their land, he would find them not cowering in their cottages, but standing in the middle of the richest harvest in the county with sickles in their hands. He came near noon, and he came in state, because Ambrose Vale had never in his life understood that state is a thing you earn and not a thing you buy. He rode up the Crossford track in a fine curricle with the sullen miller Rourke beside him and Skell the land agent behind, and a full dozen hired men at his back, and he wore a coat the colour of a pheasant and a smile like a drawn blade, and he was, Lynette saw at once, entirely certain of his triumph. He had come to watch. That was the thing she would remember. He had come, on the day he tore 7 families off the land, to enjoy it. He climbed down into the top field where they were all gathered, and he let his eyes travel over the standing corn and the sweating people and the slight woman at the center of them, and his smile widened. "What a charming harvest," said Ambrose Vale. "What a great pity that it comes too late." He drew a paper from his coat with a flourish, the Michaelmas order, the Duke's seal bright upon it. "You have all had lawful notice. These leases end today. You will lay down your tools, you will gather what you can carry, and you will be off this ground by nightfall, or these men behind me will assist you. The land is to be cleared." He turned the full force of his smile upon Lynette. "As for you, madam, I confess I am impressed. I did not think you had it in you to make so much of so little. But you have only made the harvest richer for the man who takes it, and I do thank you for that. Now stand aside." Nobody moved. 40 faces looked at him, and not one hand laid down its sickle, and not one foot stepped back. Ambrose's smile faltered for the first time. "I said stand aside. Rourke, tell them whose land this is." "It is the Duke's land," said a voice from behind the curricle, "and I will tell them whose it is myself." The Duke of Thornmere walked up out of the hedge shadow where he had stood the last quarter hour unseen, and the colour drained out of Ambrose Vale's face like wine out of a cracked cup. "Cousin," Ambrose said, "you are come. Good. You are come to see it done." "I am come to see it undone." Corwin walked into the middle of the field, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not need to, for the whole moor had gone silent as a church. "I have spent 3 weeks in this place, Ambrose, learning what a fool I have been. I have seen the mill accounts. I have seen 6 years of your creature Rourke robbing these families so that you might call them poor. I have held the letter that ruined my wife beside 100 pages of her true hand at last, as I should have done the very first hour. And any child could see they were never written by the same person." His voice dropped, and it was terrible now, low and even and final. "I signed your notices without reading them. That is my shame, and I will carry it. But I have read them now, and I have read a great deal else besides." Ambrose's tongue, which had never failed him in his life, failed him now. "Corwin, cousin, whatever that woman has told you. She has told me nothing that the accounts did not confirm twice over." Corwin turned to the sweating miller, who had gone the grey of old dough. "Rourke, my solicitor has your books. He has your false weights. He has, as of Tuesday last, your sworn confession, which you were glad enough to give once you understood how much worse it would go for you if you stayed silent." He turned back to his cousin, and now at last he let the fury show. Forgery of a hand and seal to procure a lady's ruin, Ambrose. Conspiracy to defraud the tenantry of this estate. Do you know the penalty for forgery in this county? I believe you do. I believe you have always been very careful to know exactly how far a thing may be taken before it destroys the man who tries it. The dozen hired men were already melting away toward the road, for hired men have a fine instinct for the moment a paymaster becomes a prisoner. Skell had gone entirely still, and Ambrose Vale, cornered at last on the golden field he had come to steal, made the final error of his life, the error such men always make, which is that he mistook the people around him for furniture. They are peasants, he spat, flinging out his arm at the silent tenants. Peasants and a discarded wife. You would take their word over the word of your own blood? These are people who will say whatever she tells them to say. They answer to her because she feeds them. Give them a bad winter, and they will answer to whoever fills the bin. They are loyal to their bellies, and nothing else. There is not a man among them who would not sell her for a sack of flour. And it was old Ned Prue once again who answered him. You're wrong about that, sir, said Ned, in the mild voice of a man stating the weather. We'd not sell her for the whole estate. He looked around at his neighbors, and one by one they nodded, the Collies and the Fanshaws and Amos Fenn and all of them, and Ned turned back to Ambrose Vale and said the words that would be carved 3 years later over the door of the new granary they built with the harvest of that year. There's no lord, nor agent, nor duke's cousin we'll answer to on this moor. We answer to her that knelt in Tom Colley's byre with her own 2 hands to save his cow, when she'd not a coin to her own name and no reason on this earth to care whether we lived or died. You cannot buy that, sir. You never could. That's the whole of what you never understood. Silence hung over the golden field. Then Kezia Marsh began, slowly, to clap her hard old hands together, and Tom Colley joined her, and Nell, and then the whole moor was doing it. 40 pairs of work-ruined hands, not cheering, just that steady rolling thunder of applause rising up over the standing corn, and Ambrose Vale stood alone in the middle of it with his forged paper hanging from his fingers, and understood that he had lost everything, and that he had lost it not to the Duke and not to the law, but to a cow saved in a byre on a freezing night by a woman he had thrown away. Take him to Kelby, Corwin said quietly to the 2 grooms who had ridden up behind him. The magistrate is expecting him. They led Ambrose Vale down off the moor, and he did not smile again. The harvest went on. That was the thing Linnet would treasure longest about that golden, terrible, triumphant day, that when the cousin had been led away and the danger was past, no one made speeches and no one wept for long. They simply picked their sickles back up, because the corn does not care who has won and who has lost. The corn must come in before the weather turns, and there is a deep and steadying mercy in that. It was near dusk before Corwin found her alone, at the top of the high field, looking out over the valley where the stooped sheaves stood in their long shadows like a sleeping army. He came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. It is all yours, in-law, now, he said at last. I have had the papers drawn, the 7 farms and Lark Hollow with them, settled on you outright, to hold and to manage as you see fit, for your life and your heirs after you, free of me and free of any Vale who might ever come after me. No lease to be broken, no notice to be served, no mood of any man, mine least of all, can ever put you off this ground again. He was quiet a moment. I have learned that a name and a seal are not security. You taught me that, though I was slow to the lesson. So I have given you the only security that cannot be revoked, the land itself. It is yours. Whatever else you decide, that does not change. Linnet looked at the deed he held out, and understood what it was. She had been sent here without a penny, without a settlement, with her worth denied in writing under the highest seal in the county. And now the same hand had written the opposite in the same ink, and made her a cast-off wife and the freeholder of the ground she had brought back to life. It was the completest apology a proud man had ever made, because it asked for nothing in return. "And you," she said, "what do you get, Corwin?" He was silent for a long time. When he spoke, the words came slowly and with great difficulty, for they were not words that men like him are ever taught how to say. "Nothing," he said. "That is rather the point. I am not here to strike a bargain with you, Linnet. I have nothing to offer you that you have not already built for yourself with your own 2 hands, and I am wise enough at last to know it. You do not need my name. You do not need my protection. You do not need me at all, and that, God help me, is precisely why I find I cannot leave this moor without asking." He turned to face her, and the proud, ruined, wakened man laid the last of his armor down. "I spent my whole life certain that everyone near me would betray me in the end, and I built a cold house around that certainty and called it wisdom, and it made me a man who could throw away the one good thing he had ever been given and not even trouble to look at her hand first. You are the only person who ever loved me enough to tell me the truth when it cost you everything to say it. I do not want to be forgiven, Linnet. I have no right to it. I only want, if you will have me, and only if you will have me, to spend the rest of my life learning to be the kind of man you would not have needed to survive." Linnet stood in the last gold light of the harvest she had raised out of a ruin, a free woman on her own free ground, needing nothing from the man before her. And that was exactly the thing that made her answer real, for it was the first choice about her own life she had made freely in as long as she could remember. "I did not build all this to be a duchess again," she said. "I know it. I built it because it was mine, and because these people are mine, and because I will never again be a woman who lives at the mercy of another person's mood, not yours, not anyone's. I know that too. I am not asking you to be at my mercy. I am asking to be at yours." A rough, unpracticed honesty broke through in his voice. "Come back to me not because you must, for you need never do anything because you must again. Come back, if you come at all, because you choose it. And if you choose not to, then I will ride south tomorrow, and the land is still yours, and I will trouble you no further. But I had to ask. I have spent these long months learning what it costs a man not to ask the question he is afraid of the answer to. I am done being afraid." Linnet looked at him a long moment. Then she reached out and took the deed from his hand, and folded it, and tucked it into the bodice of her plain gown over her heart, and only then, with her own freedom safe against her breast, did she step forward into the circle of his arms. "Then here is my answer," she said against his chest, "and you may take it back to your cold house and warm the place with it. I choose it. I choose you. But you will learn to read afield, Corwin Vale, and you will learn the name of every family on this moor, and you will never again sign a paper you have not read. Those are my terms." "Accepted," said the Duke of Thornmere, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed, and it was not rusty at all. They were not married again, for they had never truly been unmarried, but on the Sunday after the harvest was in, the Duke and Duchess of Thornmere walked down together to the small grey church at Cross Ford, and stood before the whole of the North Moor, and renewed the vows that had been made once in coldness, and were now made again in truth. There were no lords present, and no ladies. There was Keziah Marsh in her best black, and old Ned Prue weeping without shame, and Amos Fenn scrubbed pink and miserable in a borrowed collar, and Tom and Nell Colley with the heifer calf, grown now into a sturdy young heifer, tied in the churchyard because Nell had flatly refused to leave her home when she was the reason for the whole day. It was the strangest wedding the county had ever heard of, and the happiest. The news went south, and became, in the drawing rooms of the great, an earthquake. The story could not be made to fit any of the shapes that such stories were supposed to take. A duke had cast off a penniless wife, and instead of vanishing into ruin, she had raised his worst land into his best, won the whole tenantry to herself, exposed the cousin who wronged her, and been sought out and begged to return by the very man who had thrown her away, and had consented only on her own terms and with the freehold in her pocket. There was no scandal in it that anyone could get a grip on. There was only a woman who had been called worthless in writing and had written her own worth across 700 acres of moor in letters of gold corn for anyone with eyes to read. Ambrose Vale was tried at Kelby that Michaelmas term. The forged letter, laid beside Linnet's true hand, needed no explaining. The Miller Rourke's confession did the rest. Ambrose was spared the worst the law could have done to him, for the Duke, at his Duchess's own quiet request, spoke for the lesser sentence, on the grounds that a man learns nothing from a final reckoning, while a transported one has the whole long voyage to think. He was put aboard a ship for the far side of the world, and the North Moor never saw his smile again. A full year turned. The following harvest was richer even than the first. And on a bright, cold morning very like the one that had once carried a cast-off wife north on a farm cart with 4 shillings sewn into her hem, the Duke of Thornmere came into the low, warm kitchen of Lark Hollow, which they kept now as their own, for the great house was for business and the hollow was for living, and he found his wife at the scrubbed table with the 7 farms' accounts spread before her and a stub of pencil behind her ear and ink upon her fingers. "Are you auditing me again, Your Grace?" he asked, and the teasing in it was the ease of a man who has learned, late and gratefully, how to be happy. Lynette looked up, and the smile that came to her face had nothing guarded left in it anywhere. "Someone must," she said. "You have spent a truly indecent sum on drainage tile for the low fields." The low fields were flooding. The low fields have thicker roots than the parson's sermons, and drain twice as slow. She set down her pencil. "Sit down. You are letting the cold in, and Nell will have both our heads if you track the yard across her clean floor." And the Duke of Thornmere, who had once put this woman out of his house without a coin or a backward glance, pulled out a chair at a tenant's kitchen table and sat down across from his wife in the warm, and outside the small window the whole gold length of the North Moor rolled away under the autumn sun. Every field of it worked, every family of it fed, every soul of it, to the last child, answering still and always to no name but hers. She had come north with 4 shillings and a paper that called her worthless. She had made of it a kingdom. And she found, as her husband's hand closed warm over her ink-stained one across the table, that she would not have traded a single furrow of the road that brought her there. Did Lynette's rise from a penniless, cast-off wife to the beloved heart of the whole North Moor leave you cheering? There is nothing in this world quite so satisfying as watching a quiet, capable woman take the ruin she was handed and build a kingdom out of it, especially when it means a proud duke must learn, the hard way, exactly what he threw away. If you loved this grounded and emotional historical tale of loyalty, courage, and hard-won love, please tap that like button to support the channel. Share this story with anyone who believes the best revenge is simply to flourish, and do not forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next immersive audio drama. Tell me your favorite moment down in the comments below. Did you cheer when the whole moor turned and looked at her? I would love to know.